Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ken Jowitt, who is a distinguished teacher at the University of California at Berkeley and the Robson Professor of Political Science. He is the author, most recently, of New World Disorder and the Leninist Extinction. Ken, welcome.
Thank you, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
Ossining, New York. It's about 30 miles north of New York City. And growing up in the 40s and 50s, it was about 1 million miles from New York City. I thought the largest city in the world was White Plains, which was 12 miles away. But when I started reading about peasants and how parochial they were, I wasn't thoroughly convinced they were the only ones that were enjoying that experience.
So your place of birth pointed you in the direction of your studies, but we'll get to that in a minute. How did your parents shape your character?
Well, my mother wanted me to be a professional dancer. I thought that was good because I really enjoyed dancing and I did it well, and it meant that intellectual life for me was not something that was dull and serious and programmed. And growing up as I did in an Irish working-class Catholic neighborhood, there were experiences I had that many intellectuals who've grown up middle class and different ethnic and social backgrounds didn't have. And I've always thought I'd benefited from that variety of experience. My father wanted me to go to school. Neither of them went to college. My mother never graduated from high school. And my father was he was concerned that I not do what he did. The only time he threatened to hit me was when I told him I was thinking of going to work in the factory, and I won't quote him, but you can get the idea. He wasn't too pleased with that, so I looked to option B, which was college.
What books did you read as a young person?
Sherlock Holmes. I read a lot of Sherlock Holmes, and I read a lot of historical fiction. Again, our family was dysfunctional in the happiest sense. It was a wonderfully happy, dysfunctional family. And the thing that came out of that was I loved both my mother and father. It sounds trite, but I did. And so I liked my mother's style. She was always stylish. She liked to be a little different. And my father loved history, loved it. So basically, after we'd go to Mass, I'd sit with him, and he'd read Prince Valiant, this prince who went all over the place, Western Europe, the Middle East. And it was romantic. And I've continued to believe that your most engaging intellectual pursuits come out of if not irrational, romantic feelings. And he loved Prince Valiant, he loved Sherlock Holmes, and I read them and I found out I loved them too.
I hear themes that are going to occur later in your work, and that is the emphasis on the individual, on individuation, on carving out your own identity.
Well, yeah, that's true. I've always thought Freud was a fraud, but there's no doubt
so
that
did Fred
psychology...
Cruz.
Yes, whom I admire greatly. I don't think it was so much my psychology as how I grew up. I grew up in an Irish neighborhood, but my family de-emphasized ethnicity very much, and I was an only child. And so I grew up more with my imagination, or at least as much with my imagination as I did with my Irish friends, or my Italian friends, or in high school my Jewish friends. And so it wasn't so much an intellectual decision. It was an experience, it was an existential thing that my family valued you for who you were. Not for your religion, your ethnicity, your race, whatever. It was who you were. And you were expected to take the responsibility for that. So implicit, before it became intellectually explicit, the notion of individualism to me was the ground, the base, the primitive in that sense, value.
And one of your heroes you mentioned a moment ago, and let's talk a little about Sherlock Holmes, who you read. What did you admire most about him?
Well, it's funny. When you initially read somebody, you don't know. At least I didn't know. I liked him in part because my father liked him. My father liked the Yankees. I also liked the Yankees. So at the beginning, it's sort of an undifferentiated Genesis-like reality. But as I've continued to look at him and continue to like him, I think it's the way he combines charisma and science. And I think that Conan Doyle was a genius in effect, coming to grips with what is one of the defining questions of our age. Is charisma possible in a scientific age? And that's what Holmes does. Holmes says, I'm going to study tobacco, and ashes. And at the same time, he does miraculous things. He can tell you where you were and what you're about, and he can deduce things. And that ability on the part of an individual, not married, no really close friends except for one. I found him mysterious and scientific. Those things didn't go together. And it intrigued me. It not only intrigued me personally, but it also, I think, led me to look at phenomena in the world that I'm interested in, political phenomena, that do the same thing, that are simultaneously charismatic, whether they be sacred, mysterious, but beyond rational explanation, and at the same time effectively deal with the world. Logically, they don't go together. They went together in this fictional character, and they go together in some political phenomenon. So I wasn't simply interested, which is one of the worst words in the English language, interesting. In fact, as Holmes says to Watson, I don't care whether it's interesting, is it important? It was an important phenomenon, as well as being engaging for a kid and for an adult.
And help me understand this word charisma more, because it's a term that obviously is used in the social sciences, one that you talk about in your work. Help our audience get a better hold on that.
Well, let's start with what it isn't. It isn't being popular. Rock stars are popular. And to go to a rock concert is not to see people enthralled by charisma, it's to see people using a lot of drugs. Charisma, basically, is the ability on the part of a person to establish themselves vis-a-vis a certain audience, not everybody, as being superior, and as compelling that audience to reject their existing identity in favor of what is perceived to be a superior identity that has sacred qualities. That's what it's about. And it takes the form of a person for whom many people in the audience say, this is a charlatan. But some people say, this is the presentation of the sacred. That could be Jesus Christ, a graceful, positive figure. Could be a Hitler, a malignant figure. But charisma is rare in its ability to, in effect, engage people, more than engage, compel people to reject who they are in favor of something that is given to them, not persuaded, but imposed on them as superior. It's an imposition that's accepted. That to me is remarkable in history, and so I've always been intrigued as to who has it and what audience finds it engaging.
There's an element of the sacred in that, and the sacred along with individuation and the individual are themes that recur again in your work. Did your Catholic upbringing in part contribute to your sensitivity to these kinds of issues of the sacredness, the awe, the reverence of certain individuals or issues?
Yes. The Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, had a very ambivalent. Roman Catholicism doesn't like the individual. It likes it as the soul, but even there it's a little ambivalent. Basically, I continue to think that Christ was the most revolutionary, greatest cultural revolutionary in history. Because basically what he said is, it's the individual soul that counts, not the chosen people. And it's not simply Jews who believe in the chosen people, it's almost every group in history has assigned identity to the group, not to the person, not to the individual. Christ was a revolutionary. The Roman Catholic Church took that and basically subordinated it to the church, which is again a group. So growing up in the church, I was intrigued by the charisma of the Holy Spirit, the charisma of the Pope, and at the same time, I was very sensitive to the fact that the church was hostile to the individual. And so I grew up a somewhat annoyed, somewhat angry, as well as devout Catholic, because I loved Martin Luther more than I liked the Pope. And I liked Luther because Luther stood up against that group and said, here I stand, I can do no other before my conscience and God. And I sort of liked that courage, that individual courage. That was the courage of Sherlock Holmes or Robinson Crusoe or Christopher Columbus. And so if you point out that that's a contradiction in my life, you're absolutely right. I'm a living contradiction. I am intrigued by charisma, intrigued by the charisma of something like the Catholic Church, intrigued for 30 years with the charisma of the Communist Party, which I did not identify with, and at the same time feel antagonistic to that sort of charisma which negates the individual.
Let's talk a little about your formal education. You graduated from high school, then where did you do your undergraduate work?
I went to a Catholic high school for 3 days, and then I figured out there were no girls, and so I decided that while Catholicism was good, it wasn't really my vocation in terms of career.
So you decided against the priesthood?
I decided against the priesthood. I thought about the priesthood. I decided against the priesthood for that reason. And went to Ossining High School, which is a public high school, good high school. And then I never applied to college, really. My father was in a labor union, and he came home one day. I was planning to go into the Navy. And he said, fill out these papers. You can go to 4 or 5 different schools, Holy Cross, Fordham, Columbia, and so on. I put it down. So I put down Columbia. And I went home, and he said, well, why'd you choose Columbia? You're Catholic. There's nothing at Columbia but communists and Jews. So I said, it's a little rigid of you, a little narrow, but, I'm tired of all this. I know what it is to be a Catholic. Well, the point of the matter is I scored well enough on the Regents and so on, and one day Andy, the mailman, came in and said, here's a big package, and you've been given a 4-year scholarship to Columbia. So I went to Columbia and ended up studying communist and marrying a Jew, which was not bad, not bad. So Columbia, to me, it's interesting. I think about 30 years after I graduated from there, it was 30 years, 25, 30 years. They had a reunion. So one of the deans called me up and said, would you like to write something? How Columbia's added to your life. And on the phone, I said, it didn't add anything to my life. And so he got very upset. What do you mean it didn't add? I said, it didn't add a thing. It gave me a life. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what it did. It gave me a life. It just exposed me to teachers and to people and to history that obviously no one person could live, but that I could make a claim out of. It was a claim on. It was a joy. It was absolutely a joy. And then in 62, I also was given a fellowship to come here. Actually, I was rejected at Berkeley.
As an undergraduate?
No, as a graduate. Yeah, I was turned down. And then they found out I had a 3-year scholarship. I'm sure there was no connection. But they then discovered there had been an error.
I see. Yeah.
So I was then accepted. And so when I received tenure about 25 years ago, I put that next to the telegram that said that they really loved me, but that my work wasn't quite good enough at that time. And I thought that was a nice sequence.
In your studies, you focused, as a political scientist, on Marxist-Leninist systems.
Yes.
You pointed at some of the reasons that led you to those studies. And, we are now interviewing you at the end of a century in which Marxist-Leninism has, in your words, become instinct. So we're going to imagine that you're the curator of the Jurassic Park for Leninism, and we'll let you be Richard Attenborough and help us sort of understand what Marxist-Leninism meant for this century. What were its defining features as a political ideology?
Well, it's quite remarkable. I think that from one perspective, and obviously there are others, but from one perspective that's neglected, Leninism and Nazism were each, in different ways, perverse attempts to sustain and restore a heroic ethos in life in opposition to a liberal bourgeois individualistic system, which I obviously prefer. But if you look at the Bolshevik cadre and you look at the Nazi SS, both of whom were perversely not murderous in the course of their histories, what one saw was an attempt to co-opt features of the industrial, urban, educated, scientific, technologically advanced world while rejecting the liberal notion of individual liberty, of rational methodical acquisition, of the bourgeois, the entrepreneur, of law as procedure, of merit defined in terms of achievement, in favor of a fundamentally irrational, charismatic, ecstatic sense of being able to overcome the necessities of life. And in that sense, they were attempted substitutes. Now, what makes Leninism more interesting than Nazism, because to be a Nazi, all you had to do was buy a particularly colored shirt, a torch, and sing at night. I mean, that basically, Nazism did not demand much in the way of intellectual conversion and intellectual commitment. It was fairly easy to join. Leninism intrigued me because it was, in a sense, a sociological discipline. It formally tried to understand what was happening in history. It had an empirical orientation. It had an intellectual corpus to it in Marx. And what fascinated me was that these modern elements were systematically subordinated to, not related to, but subordinated to this charismatic, heroic notion, not in an individual. I'm aware of Stalin and Mao and Hoxha and all the rest of them, but the defining principle of Leninism is to do what is illogical, and that is to make the impersonal charismatic. Charisma is typically associated with a saint or with a knight, some personal attribution. And what Lenin did was remarkable. He did exactly what he claimed to do. He created a party of a new type. He made the party charismatic. People died for the party. It's as if people would die for the DMV. You know, most people don't get too excited about the Department of Motor Vehicles because it's a bureaucracy. What Lenin did was combine the attributes of personal heroism and the efficiency of impersonal organization and create a charismatic organization. That's been done before. It's been done by Benedictines, it's been done by Jesuits, but it's never been done by a political party before. That intrigued me. When things that logically don't go together practically work, I'm intrigued. Furthermore, what it did was compel the allegiance of people all the way from Peru to Kenya to Brooklyn. That's extraordinary by definition. History, for the most part, is Protestant. It is diverse. People are diverse. Cultures are diverse. When you get an Islam or a Roman Catholicism or a Leninism or a British liberalism that, in effect, in some real way standardizes diverse cultures over time, that's one of the remarkable moments in history. And I wanted to study this remarkable moment. And I did, and frankly, I'm glad it's over because I want to get on to other things.
Now, in your book, New World Disorder, the Leninist Extinction, which includes essays that you've written over the course of your studies, you are constantly dealing with the contradictions implicit in the operation of this model. And what I'm curious about, looking back now, what was the fundamental contradiction that brought this system down?
I think the fundamental contradiction is that it couldn't handle the individual, purely and simple. And it couldn't handle the individual in the form of the citizen. There's no better example than Solidarity. Solidarity is this mass movement, 8 million Poles out of 30 million Poles, 1980.
Which becomes the major challenge to this
challenge to the Communist Party. What was the major challenge? The major challenge was that Solidarity argued that the individual as a moral person, as the source of integrity, as the entity responsible for its actions, as the source of conscience, was to be juxtaposed to this corporate group, to this group, outside of which you had no identity. The Catholic Church and the Communist Party, in formal terms, are very much alike. The Middle Ages, Catholic Church said outside the church there's no salvation. Communist Party said the exact same thing. In Solidarity, you didn't have one group against another group. You had an association of individual citizens, and ironically enough for a Marxist system, they were workers. In effect, saying, we don't need the tutelage of this group. We don't need you for salvation. And I think that was the undoing of communism, its inability to recognize in moral terms and in political terms the individual.
Now, over the years, many of its leaders tried in different ways to reform the system, make it work. And you write about them, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev. What was it inevitable that they all would fail for the reasons that you just gave?
I think I think the beginning of the end for Leninism was in 1956 when Khrushchev ended class war. I think in every ideology you find an Augustine and an Aquinas. And the Augustines are those who argue that they represent the superior and the rest of the world is inferior. You have to attack the inferior, maintain the cohesiveness and the bounded quality of the superior, the city of God versus city of man. Now, I'm not arguing Stalin was a Roman Catholic or an Augustinian, but in analogous terms, they were the same. As soon as you dissolve the tension between that superior group and the society, unless the group is willing to allow those people in society to be equal as individuals, there's only one thing that can happen to that group. It becomes corrupt. And so Aquinas, in effect, tried to revise the church to deal with the fact that the society become more Christian. Khrushchev was communism's Aquinas. But neither Aquinas nor Khrushchev allowed for the individual to become the major figure. Rather, the church stayed superior. Even under Aquinas, the party stayed superior. What happened in the church? You got a Luther. What happened in the Communist Party? You got a Lech Walesa and an Adam Meekman. And what did they stand for? They stood for the appearance of the individual against the domination of that group.
And in places like the Soviet Union, this inability had international consequences because ultimately it meant that it couldn't the party couldn't reform the party and therefore compete, say, the Soviet Union with the United States.
That's right. What's even more remarkable is that the Soviet Union could never have been defeated. There are 2 points to that. First of all, many people accuse those studying the Soviet Union of failing to predict this. Well, first of all, no one's Nostradamus. In fact, Nostradamus wasn't Nostradamus. He just wrote so unintelligibly, people say that, he predicted things. So,
and you can use it in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, yes.
Exactly, which is more than appropriate. The point simply is that not only can't you beat Nostradamus, if one looks at this whole question of the Soviet Union had to fall, I would argue it's more an issue of dialysis, not analysis. I mean, Andropov, who was the leader, basically his kidneys failed. And had Andropov been a healthy man, we'd be sitting here today talking about what the Soviet Union's doing. Mm-hmm. There was no inevitability that the Soviet Union had to fail at that particular point in time. It could have gone on for another 20 years, had the world's third largest economy, thermonuclear weapons, second, strike, all of these magical things. The remarkable thing is that the Soviet Union went out with a whimper, not a bang. That, in effect, it dissolved itself. And my explanation for that's very simple. It was so corrupt, so rotten, that the individuals who made it up had no capacity to sacrifice for anything outside themselves and their family. And so it dissolved itself. It wasn't SDI. It wasn't the failure of the economy. It was terminal rot.
So it failed as a charismatic institution.
Exactly. And that's because with Khrushchev, it did away. Every charismatic has to have combat. Otherwise, you work for Wells Fargo. The fact that
it has to have what, I'm sorry?
You have to have a combat quality.
Okay.
There has to be an enemy to sustain your need to convert the world. If you've converted the world, charismatics go out of business. And what Khrushchev said in 1956 is we've defeated the internal class enemy and we've established parity with the United States, which means all we have to do now is buy VCRs.
What could Andropov have done that Gorbachev couldn't do?
I think, first of all, he wouldn't have dissolved the party. What he would have done is had a reform movement. He would have purged a lot of the corrupt people. He would have brought in less corrupt people, a younger generation, a more educated generation of Soviet-trained apparatchiks, and they would have sustained it. I mean, look at the Ottoman Empire. It took it 300 years to finally admit it was dead. Now, why should an empire with thermonuclear weapons not stay around?
So what is the legacy of Marxist-Leninism?
Well, that is a truly interesting and important question. The legacy is phenomenal in one sense because history is not dialectical, but it certainly is ironical. Here you had a Marxist regime in some respects that has no legacy in the positive sense. Marx said every formation in history only falls apart when it's within itself given rise to a new one. The Soviet legacy, in the sense of a new principle of organizing economic, social, and political life, gave us nothing. Gave us nothing. Basically, its legacy is fragmentation. It's an almost entirely negative legacy. They created an industry of the 90s. Unfortunately, it was the 1890s. So that, it's not Silicon Valley. It's Pittsburgh of 1950. They didn't allow any association in society, so they left us no civil society. They left us no tradition or practice of citizenship. They gutted the state. The party, in effect, didn't allow for a state or a society. They misdeveloped the economy. What have they left us? I think there's a word, Michigan. They left us a mess.
Yeah. So the only legacy, in a way, was the men like Havel and Mitnick who stood up against it and stood their ground and said no, as Luther had.
They left us highly principled and, for the most part, isolated individuals whom I admire greatly. Adam Mitnick, I think, is one of the great figures of the 20th century, in large part because he's so human, by which I mean fallible. The sad thing is that the legacy was not in any way political. There was no liberal legacy, no political legacy. It was a legacy of charismatically ethical individuals who themselves are experiencing entropy, not in their personal lives, but in terms of their impact on society. I think the real legacy in the ethical sense of communism is grubby materialism. The funny thing about Marxism-Leninism, if you read one of Marx's greatest pieces on the Jewish question, he talks about bourgeois society as made up of egos, competitive, hedonistic, selfish. There is nowhere in the world that was as true as in communist countries. That's the legacy.
One of the themes, I think, that appears in your work, and you said this just now, is the failure of communism and Marxist-Leninism to make citizens of the people that it served. And a lot of your recent writing today is on the question of democracy and the individual. And I want to read a quote from you from your recent essay in the introduction to Mitnick's book. Democracy requires that most extraordinary of cultural inventions, the individual, informed by conscience aware of his and her independent, not derived value and complementary identities. Help us understand that sentence.
Well, basically, what it means is any group you belong to are second. I'm Irish and English and Roman Catholic. I'm Irish on March 17th, and if I feel like it, I'm March 18th, and if I don't feel like it, I'm not Irish. In short, my identities are not derived. My grandmother, bless her, when I first dated an Italian girl, I won't tell you what she said, but it was not pleasant. When I dated a Jewish girl, she was so shocked she couldn't even say anything negative.
I see. See, it's an argument for extreme positions.
Yes, but the point simply is that when you talk about individualism, what you're talking is not the absence of group affiliations. I'm very happy to be Irish in descent. I'm happy that my wife is Jewish and Protestant, that she was middle class, I was working class. Those complementarities are part of who I am. But my identity is not derived from being my grandmother's Irish Catholic grandson or anything of the kind. And we live in an age now when that sort of categoric identity is very fashionable, especially in the area we're having this interview. And frankly, I find it an absolute disaster. It's one thing to make your identity paramount when you're being attacked for that. If I were a Jew in 1930 in Germany, I would not be saying I have complementary identities. When somebody's trying to kill me because I was a Jew, I'd probably be a Zionist. Mm-hmm. But that's situational. The question is, essentially, how do you define yourself? And if you define yourself as an individual, by definition, a good part of your life, you're going to be lonely. And that's why my greatest hero intellectually is Max Weber, who in effect led a lonely life. I think a little alienation is a damn good thing.
You go on to say, because you've touched on the threat posed by corporate identity,
yes.
and of course we're seeing now in the world the threat of extreme hyper-ethnicity. You also write in the Extinction book, liberal capitalism fails adequately to provide for the essential group needs and dimensions of human existence. Rejection of heroic ethic, awe, and mystery that throughout most of history has separated man from animal and necessity. So the point here is that for all its support in theory of the individual, it fails to provide that element of charisma, which also you've been trying to analyze and look at.
That's right.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm saying the following. If you ask me what I am, I'm a liberal Republican capitalist with small letters, not caps. But that's what I am. And I am while recognizing that being a liberal of the 19th century variant, being a Republican of a classical sense, being a capitalist, being a Democrat, all of those things, that those are partisan statements. While favoring those, and I think they have brought us about the greatest civilization that we've known to date, they are inadequate. I take seriously when the Roman Catholic Church says that the family counts, not simply the individual. That's a tension that we have to deal with. It's up to us as individuals to deal with that. I don't see it as either or. But I do recognize that liberal capitalism, liberal capitalist democracy, in and of itself, if it is absolutized, is evil. It's bad. It's wrong. You can use whatever term you want. It has to be modified. There have to be important adjectives around it. I am saying, however, that the core of my beliefs are those liberal, Republican, democratic, and capitalist ones. It is at the same time true that they fail to adequately deal with elements of the human condition, the need for security, the need for heroic achievement. That's why we watch football and like astronauts. The need, in effect, for emotion, to be evocative, not just analytic. My point simply is to raise the question, which set of orientations, virtues, and commitments set the terms for the others? My life, it's the liberal ones, the individualistic ones. It is the capitalist ones. It is the democratic ones. Those are the ones that set the terms for the heroic, the emotional, and the other. So it's not just a question of it's one or the other, or should they all come together. It's not a mishmash, and it's not absolute. It's a complementarity in which one set of values, commitments, and behaviors set the terms for the others.
Under what circumstances does corporate identity become the basis of social fragmentation, mutual hate, and violence? I mean, is it because there is a failure to mediate the tension between the individual and the group?
Well, first, let's be clear. When we say corporate identity, we're not talking about General Motors. We're talking about a form of identification where persons don't have an identity outside of that group. They just lack it. My sense is that corporate identities, to the extent to which they're absolute, are always evil. Why are they evil? One, they make it easier to commit violence on someone else. If I don't know you as Harry Kreisler and you don't know me as Ken Jowitt, rather you grew up Jewish and I grew up Roman Catholic, I can kill you easily. You're just a Jew. I'm just a Catholic. So you can gas the Jew, lynch the Catholic, starve the Protestant, whatever. It lowers the threshold for violence when you don't have an individual worth that's recognized by others. Second thing is it allows violence to go on almost indiscriminately. If it's not you hurt me, therefore I'm going to try to hurt you, but rather you as a member of a group hurt me, then I can hit your son. I can tell Jeremy, I don't care that you didn't bother me. You're your father's son. I'm going to hit you. He in turn could hit my wife. So the violence spreads circumference-wise. Finally, the violence spreads over time because if you did an injustice to my grandfather, I have to do an injustice to your grandson. Corporate identities, where they are dominant, always lead to greater degrees of violence. And because I don't like violence, because I like the Enlightenment, because I like the importance of intellect and persuasion, I favor the individual and reason.
You use the word relativize a lot.
Yes.
And I believe that, is it correct to say that you feel in appropriately organized public space and public discourse in a democracy, well, in fact, I'll quote you. You say, to create and sustain a civic, democratic, tolerant way of life, one must relativize absolute ethnic, religious, and ideological identities.
Yes. Yeah.
Bring proportion.
Pardon me?
Bring proportion.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I use the word ethnic light, like Miller Lite or Bud Light. I think that ethnicity, as I said, I think ethnicity in the sense of bringing, potentially bringing, doesn't necessarily bring, and it doesn't always bring good things, but potentially bringing elements, types of experience that otherwise you wouldn't have, is a valuable thing. When you absolutize, basically, first of all, you're making one's personal life stingy. You're ruling out other experiences. You're ruling out the risk that comes with maturation. You're ruling out the need for judgment on the part of the individual. So when I say relativize, I don't mean relativistic. I believe some things are better than other things. I really think the Ten Commandments are better than a lot of other injunctions as to how one should behave, for example. So it's not a matter that anything is good as long as it doesn't hurt you, which is the trite philosophy of Northern California today, an area populated more by therapists than people. But if you look, I'm always fearful of dogma. You could say, well, that's very odd being Roman Catholic. Well, I'll grant you that. It's odd. But I think dogma in the form of absolutizing an ethnic identity or racial identity, except in a situation where you're going to be, dealt with violently, I think it is the greatest sin. I think it's the greatest ethical sin. I think it's the greatest behavioral sin is to absolutize your identity. So when I say relativize, I mean just what I said about giving you an example of my marriage. I think, in effect, that being relativized doesn't dilute you. What it does is place the individual in a position where they have to make a judgment and take a risk. If I had grown up Irish Catholic and married an Irish Catholic working class girl, what risk would that have been? None. What judgment would it have taken? None. Might have been a good marriage. I'm not saying everybody that does it is making a mistake. I'm saying quintessentially, a society based on the individual is a society that enriches itself by taking risks to go beyond your own experience and self.
Implicit in what you're saying, besides the public space where this relativizing may occur, you're really suggesting the need for a moral imagination in politics.
Yes.
Is that correct? And then where do we obtain experiences and training these days to acquire that imagination?
Well, it's very hard in the United States. It's difficult. And in part, it's not this country's fault. When things are going very well, and they are going very well, there's no question there's poor, there's sick, there could be a more effective distribution of wealth, not by some crass redistribution, but there could be. The fact of the matter is, when times are good, it's very difficult to locate the source of or leverage for moral courage. And yet some people in a society will always demonstrate it. Why is that? One is temperament. You just can't get beyond it. I don't care, nurture, nature, all this silly binary stuff. There's some people who are going to stand up and be like Luther. They're simply going to do it. Many of those people don't even know it until the challenge is made. So part of it is just their temperament, genetic makeup. Second thing is their parents. Do they see evidence not of simply reasonable persuasion, which is the middle class is ridden with it today, not its own, it learns it from its therapy, what they should say to their children. But the fact is there the self-confidence to demonstrate courage? I think courage to me is the single greatest virtue in life. It's not the only one. I think goodness, I think sociability, I think intellect, all of those are valuable. But without courage, you never realize the fullness of anything. So if you grow up in a setting where you see a person, not a role model, but an inspiration. Role models are boring. An inspiration. Do you see a Martin Luther King? I saw Martin Luther King. Man inspired me. That's not supposed to happen. After all, I'm a live white male, and he wasn't white. But the fact of the matter is that's one of the greatest inspirations I've seen growing up. Do you see inspirational figures that are willing to sacrifice for their courage? That, to me, is something that affects people wherever, whatever their gender, their race, their ethnicity, what their age is. Are there enough of those figures that are experienced by enough people in a population, vicariously, directly, whatever? I think that provides the moral basis of courage. Having inspirational figures. The closer they are to you, the better. You see it in your mother and father. You see it in your brother and sister. You see it in a close friend. It leaves you with something incredibly important which people don't appreciate enough, embarrassment. You get embarrassed not to be courageous yourself.
Because you want to win their respect?
That's right. Absolutely right. And that's a lovely thing. If you're going to look to others, don't look to them for applause or money or, promotions or the next grant or fellowship. Look to those who warrant respect for respect. That's an extraordinary achievement. That's pre-Christian. That's pre-Christian. That's something that is not part of Christian theology, but I think is an incredibly valuable thing.
Throughout our discussion, these themes of the sacred, awe, respect, the charismatic keep emerging, and on the other hand, this notion of respect for the dignity of the individual. And so therefore I want to read you something that you wrote. You said, the need for democracy and the need for the sacred make up one of life's immutable dilemmas, except for extraordinary circumstances, such as revolutionary situations, I assume you mean. Democracy and the sacred are conflicting imperatives.
That's right. I think essentially, if you take them in their purest form, basically what charisma and the sacred say is there's one truth. That's the key to what charismatics are about. One truth. Charismatics are not pleasant people. I always get a kick when people say, oh, charismatics are engaging and attractive. No charismatic is anything less than frightening. I mean, it's always nice when I talk to other Christians and they'll say, well, Jesus at Cain had changed water into wine. If I had been at Cain, I would have been scared to death that he would have changed me into water. Charismatics have extraordinary power, and they are always coercive in the sense that they tell you there's one truth. Democracy, in effect, and I should add liberal democracy, not democracy in the sense of just equality. I think that per se just leads to the tyranny of the masses. But liberal democracy, democracy based on the individual, not the crowd or the mob or the group. Liberal democracy, in effect, relativizes truths. And one has to, as an individual, relate what possibly you might believe is as an absolute truth, if you're a Roman Catholic. And a liberal Democrat, which says, no, you have to relativize truth. And it is up to the individual to put those things together. Sometimes you can't finesse it. Sometimes you have to say, here I stand. Democracy is wrong. Here I stand. The Roman Catholic Church is wrong. Ultimately, there's, as Martha and the Vandellas put it, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The individual has to be the ultimate locus of responsible decision.
And do you think democracy today allows that to happen?
Not really. I think one of the sad things, and this raises a topic that's really too broad to just go into briefly, religion and democracy. It is hard for me to believe that a democracy can sustain itself without some beliefs that are transcendental, that give people the courage to stand up and fight for something, because otherwise people will they'll basically compromise and make a decision to split the difference. It'll be a marginal thing, a little bit for you, a little bit for me. There's some issues where you have to simply stand. And I don't think most people have that conviction in the absence of something transcendental. By the way, it doesn't have to be religion. In the 19th century, people were willing to risk a lot to be a liberal capitalist. It took heroism, as Weber and Polanyi points out. It took heroism, perverted in most respects, but communists could be heroes. You know, they could die fighting those Nazis. A lot of French didn't do that. The fact of the matter is that in order to sustain a principle in a situation of adversity, you need it. So in a contradictory way, democracy, which I think should in its essence be empirical, which should be Sancho Panza, it shouldn't be Don Quixote, that Sancho Panza at critical moments needs a Don Quixote to sustain it while recognizing that reliance on a Don Quixote, no matter when, threatens it. That's the human condition.
You wrote something that really is another way of saying what you just said. In situations in which it might be rational to run, not fight, doubt, not believe, punish, not forgive, reject, not accept, to quit. In those situations, morality and a sense of the sacred can be a source of courage, confidence, mercy, toleration, and endurance.
I think that's, if I hadn't written that, I'd agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. And I think, again, that the mature person, and we don't talk enough about maturation. We always talk about how intelligent, how smart somebody is, or how successful they are. That's all well and good, but I think in the absence of some transcendental beliefs, some of which are more benign than others, some of which are outright malignant, that one has very little in the way of inner resource to stand when it makes much more sense to run or to be graceful, not simply rational.
Here I'll quote Max Weber, who you quote actually. It is immensely moving when a mature man is aware of a responsibility for the consequences of his conduct and really feels such responsibility with heart and soul. He then acts by following an ethic of responsibility, and somewhere he reaches the point where he says, "Here I stand, I can do no others."
I think that's what Harry Truman did when he ordered the atomic bomb. I think that people who give these partisan and parochial and, for the most part, superficial arguments that this was just an immoral action. Others, of course, give a much more serious and substantial critique, which I take seriously, but most don't. I think that's exactly what Harry Truman did. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to graduate from School of Theology. I think Harry Truman sat and said to himself, I'm aware that this is an ultimate act with consequences that I may regret morally, not just politically. I can't do anything but this now. So I don't think you have to look in history very far back to see an instance of exactly what Weber was saying.
Ken, you're a political theorist, you're a social scientist, but in addition, you're a comparativist. And again, the broad range of the comparisons that you're able to make help us inform the complexity of a situation. Tell us about that skill, and how do you learn it? Or do you just have to be very smart?
No, I don't think it's just being smart. I really don't think it's being simply smart, because smart takes different paths. I have no idea where this started, but I thank God for it, namely analogy. I can't see something without thinking of an analogy. It drives my wife crazy. But that, and it goes back to Prince Valiant. If I sit down in an elevator that's stuck, God forbid, all I want is a book of history. I don't want a political science text. I want a historical reference. I think basically it comes down to two things. One, imagination, and two, analogy. Do you have imagination? Some people are incredibly bright, and they're dull. Some people, while being dull, are rigorous, systematic. They're Sancho Panza. And I like, Don Quixote a little more. If somebody who was very kind, I'm not sure they intended to be, but they were very kind. When they were reviewing this book, said, Jowitt really is an artist more than a social scientist. And if he were an artist, he'd be Picasso or a Cubist, because he put things together in novel ways. I've always thought it was the nicest thing anybody ever said about me. And I think it comes down a lot to just the temperament you have. I don't think you learn it. I simply don't think it's available in a formal pedagogical way. You have an imagination that I hope has some disciplined by the material you read, but the intrinsic interest in this wide array of historical material is just that. It's intrinsic. I don't think you can explain where it came from in my case or in the case of other people who have that same bias.
Can students prepare for doing this kind of work?
I don't know. I'm not very self-conscious or reflective in terms of how to teach. I love to teach. There's nothing I enjoy more than teaching. But I'm not sure you can do it other than by inspiration and example. I genuinely, there are techniques, there are procedures, and I don't wish to minimize, let alone demean them. But I don't think ultimately that's what it's about. I really think in almost every profession in life, many are called and few are chosen. And they're chosen for different things, so because there's a lot of things, a lot of vocations, it means that everybody can be chosen for something. But to do intellectual life and to be creative or original in some way, I think you have to see somebody who shows it in the flesh, which is why I don't believe you should teach through television. I think you should be face-to-face. I don't care how large the group, but you should be face-to-face. There's a palpable quality. And the other thing is there has to be a resonance in the individual. If there isn't, fine. They can do something equally wonderful, but not that. They might be bright, not creative. They might be rigorously thoughtful, but not imaginative. I think you need an example, a living example of someone doing that, and it has to resonate in you. You have to say, that's what I can do. That's my kind of tango. That's what you do.
A book that keeps coming up again and again, knowing you and even in our conversation, is the Bible, actually. But I think it's not you. It's not just reading it as a religious person. I'm not even addressing that, right. But really as a social scientist and as a political theorist. Tell us about that.
Well, I find it an unending source of insight, not in religious terms at all. I'm quite clear as an individual what my private life is and what my professional life is. But the Iliad, the Bible, and Sherlock Holmes are an unending source of intellectual insights for me. So if I want to look, for example, at how you create an organization, how you consolidate that organization, and then how it expands and dissolves, Saul, David, and Solomon, to me, are as good an example or set of examples as anything you'll ever find. Why should I deny myself one of the richest pieces of ethical, critical, political, administrative, religious insight in the world and turn to something written by somebody with a PhD who is not the equal of the author of David? In fact, there's just a new book, a new translation of David out by one of our colleagues here in the classics department. Same thing with the Iliad. And the same thing with Sherlock Holmes. Same thing with Weber, whom I refer to more than anybody. I'd rather read a very good book 10 times than 10 mediocre books. And what it is in each of these, it isn't a single lesson or an insight from the Bible and one from Sherlock Holmes and one from the Iliad and one from Weber. It's rather all of these deal with issues that I think are perennial in the human condition, and that I think Weber has formulated best. I'm interested in those things that are charismatic. I'm interested in those things that are traditional in the sense in which he meant. I'm interested in those things that are modern. And in those sources, I can't deplete their richness. You know? I wish I could duplicate it. That's not even conceivable in my case. But I can at least be smart enough to take advantage of them.
But again, I hear you saying, and I know from experience and from this conversation, it's a question of applying your imagination to these materials, because somebody else could read these things and say,
That's
the
right.
Bible is outdated,
That's
and who wants to read a 19th century detective?
That's true. I think ultimately you either have this capacity. Analogies have limits. Fine. Now we've stated the obvious. But I'm currently working on a book. I don't write books, but I'm working on a book. Basically, 3 essays. You put them together, you call it a book.
We could build a website for you then, too. That's right.
Yeah. And it's based, the subject matter, whether it's titled Frontiers, Barricades, and Boundaries. All right? Just I'll give you an example so you and anybody who risked watching this can see whether this imagination of mine is really a hallucination. But let's take frontiers. I'm sitting down, I'm thinking, what is a frontier condition? So you have images. Right? That's what I begin with. My image of a frontier is a singles bar. A singles bar is, how did I get this idea? I have no idea. I don't use drugs. It just came to me. I'm sitting there and I'm saying to myself, what is a single bar? It's a bunch of people who don't know each other, who, in the lingo, hook up, go home, have sex, don't see each other again, can't remember each other's names, go back to the bar and meet somebody else. So it's a world that's made up of disconnections. Right? Now, I said, what's a barricade? Now, I have an analogy in mind. People's relation. A barricade is a Roman Catholic marriage. It's the exact opposite of hooking up and forgetting what the person's name was. You get married, you can't get divorced. It's all over. You are locked in forever, okay? Unless you're the Kennedys and get an annulment or something. But you're locked in. You're basically locked in. What's a boundary? You continue with that analogy. A boundary is divorce. Forgive me. It's marriage with the possibility of divorce. All right? Same thing I was thinking again, because that's what I start with. I start with an idea. I think of an image, an analogy. It doesn't prove anything. Analogies can't prove anything. It gives you an insight into the character of a phenomenon. I'm thinking of frontiers. I think of the Los Angeles freeway. You go down and you have 4 lanes. People don't signal. They cut each other off. If they really dislike it, they shoot you. I mean, it's sort of, those boundaries are supposed to be real, but they mean nothing. Now, I lived with Becca for almost a year in Romania. In any communist country, the central lane of a highway was just for the Communist Party bosses. If you went into that lane, you did not get a ticket. You went immediately to jail. Or you were thrown out of the country, or you could be hurt. Then you come to a place where people are civilized. I can't find this imaginary place, but that is to say a highway where there are lanes. You can cross them, unlike the barricade, but you use your signal in a civil way, and then you go. Well, that's an example. I think that's imaginative. I think it relates to the same analogy. I think the analogy is fertile. The question is, now can you make more specific arguments that can be tested? That's a different stage. But can you teach that to somebody? I don't really think so.
Since I assume you're not writing a book on single bars,
I'm not.
then these images that you've just discussed are really the working materials to guide your insights about the way the world is going. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's exactly right. What I'm trying to do, in effect, is I've looked at most of the literature written in the last 10 years, which predicts the future, the Nostradamuses. Huntington, we're all going to live in cultural bunkers that aren't going to interact with one another, orthodox and cynic. I mean, his image of the world is Fu Manchu versus the Lone Ranger. You're going to have all these Chinese civilizations against the West and so on. Then I look at Robert Kaplan, just the opposite. It's going to be anarchy. The future of the world is Sierra Leone. 14-year-olds on drugs shooting everybody who comes along. And there are a number of these predictions, and these are, a person like Huntington has a powerful intellect. He's made major contributions. They're all trying to be Nostradamus. They're trying to specify the content of the future. I think that's a level of intellectual conceit that simply isn't warranted. We can't do that. So in reading them and saying this isn't the way to go, I said, how can you frame the world so that we can see what types of, in the formal sense, realities are out there? I think we're living in a world that's increasingly made up of frontiers, of disconnections. I think frontiers, because they create uncertainty and risk, generate ideas and organizations that are barricades. So my prognosis for the future is not that we'll have civic and civil boundaries, but that out of this increasingly frontier, disorienting world, you're going to get new ideologies and new movements that are barricaded. Barricade means dogma. Dogma means coercion. I don't like them. And so I want to look at the world and see where these new barricades may be arising. Who are the representatives? What are the countries? What are their resources? It enables me to start to examine empirically what the world is. So imagination I think of as the word. Concrete studies I think of as the flesh. And I enjoy doing that.
As you look ahead to the future, how would you advise students to prepare for it? Or is that too presumptuous a question?
I don't think it is at all. I think as a political scientist, and I'm happy to be a political scientist, I like to generalize. Historians for the most part know. I'm interested in questions of power and leadership and what we've talked about before. I think it is incredibly indulgent not to study the past. And Americans are singularly uninformed about their history and the past of the world. We should study. The best preparation for understanding the 21st century is to study the 20th. I will always remember the first line in Henry Chadwick's book on primitive Christianity. The first sentence is, the first Christians were Jews. What is the point? The point is something new always comes from something old. So if we're going to, in effect, try to understand the contours of the new, you don't sit down, close your eyes, squeeze them tight and say, I want to think of the new, I want to think of the new. Begin with the old. What are the defining features of this century and what cultures, what parts of the world, which are likely to have the longest half-life and to shape the emergence, not determine, shape the emergence of the new. Start with what we know. So I would tell a student, know your history.
Ken, thank you very much for taking this time and talking about your life and your work.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's been a treat.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.